did fibrous and connective tissue and cartilage, and we just finished up with bone. There's one more connective tissue that we haven't done yet. Anybody have an idea what it is? We're not going to do it until next semester. That's probably why it's not at the forefront of your thinking. Blood. Yeah, cells within the matrix. All right. So this unit and the next unit is nerve, and then we finish up the semester with muscle. So we have two systems, two units on the nervous system. The first unit is primarily anatomy. All right, it's the parts of the spinal cord in the brain and the pathways that the neurons follow. And then our second unit, for the functional, I mean, we'll learn what the frontal lobe does and what the parts of the brainstem do. But the mechanism of how a nerve impulse is formed and conducted will be the beginning of the second nerve unit, and autonomic nervous system and special senses, how the eye and ear function. So at the end of each of those nerve units, we have a lecture exam. But so this first nerve lecture packet is just for that first nerve unit on the brain and sensory and motor pathways. And then we have the second nerve unit and then one lab exam. So the lab packet that's over there covers both units. So for our next exam, we'll have only a lecture exam. All right, there won't be a lab exam. We'll continue to have reviews on the parts of the brain and stuff, so you won't forget it. But there'll continue to be times when you can go over that material. We'll be doing it when we do those components. So today, we don't have a lab, all right? You'll probably be done here at about 12:30, and we'll have a break in between. I won't lecture the entire time. 12:30, 12:45, because I need to talk about the material. We don't have enough models to look at just the brain, the ventricles or something. So then tomorrow we'll finish up, do a little review of the ventricles we're doing today, the blood supply and how CSF is formed, and then we'll have the lab part with that. Okay? So your lecture exams, I've run the Scantrons, I've graded the fill-ins. I have about I've only done about a quarter of the extra credit. It's not going it's not taking very long, but I still have a little bit more to do. So I learned my lesson. I'm not going to make any promises about being done tomorrow, but I'm going to try for that, okay? So probably not the lab exam, but I'll try and get the lecture exams back to you tomorrow. All right, so nervous system. First of all, we're just going to look at the organization of the nervous system, and then at the tissue. So the cells, the connective tissue cells that support the nerves, the neuron itself. And then we'll take a break and about a 25-minute lecture on neurodevelopment. And we'll come back, review that tomorrow, and move on into blood supply. So the organization of the nervous system can be done both by location and by general function. Remember at the very beginning when we were talking about anatomical terminology, we looked at dorsal cavity and mostly spent our time with ventral cavities in the thoracic and abdominal and pelvic. So what was the structural support and definition of the dorsal cavities? What defined the dorsal cavities?
The skull.
Well, that's what was in them, but yeah, skull. So the skull containing the brain, and the spinal cord is in the spinal canal, vertebral canal, the framing, remember the vertebral frame, and then each vertebra lined up to create a hollow space. So when we look at location, we get, for the central nervous system, within the cranial cavity, we have the brain. Within that bony support, and within the vertebral canal, again within that bony support, we have the spinal cord. All right, so if I were to diagram that loosely on the board, we would have the brain and the brain stem. That would be within the cranial cavity, all right? If you're not aware what the brain stem is, it's the structures that are involved with the reflexive coordination of breathing and your heart rate, so the pons, the medulla, the midbrain. And that brings me to an apology of sorts, or a warning, depending on how you want to take it. I will probably find some frustration in the first couple of weeks of this unit, because to describe locations and functions, I'm going to have to use terms and relate it to components of the nervous system we haven't talked about yet, just by the very nature of it. So that's going to go, it's going to be confusing, but each next lecture, as we do it, more and more of it will relate to something we've already said and will make more sense. Okay? So just be aware of that. You can look things up, you know, when you are reading ahead or going back and rereading, oh, that's what she was talking about. But expect to not fully see how it all fits together until we get more of this immaterial under our belt, so to speak. So foramen magnum is kind of where we separate brainstem from spinal cord, and it's not just a structural location. There's a definite change in structure. And then down within the vertebral canal, we have the spinal cord. Okay? So that's the central nervous system. Any structure of the brain or brainstem or spinal cord is considered to be a component of the central nervous system. And then we have the peripheral nervous system. And these are bundles of neurons that enter or exit the central nervous system and are found out in the body. All right? So we're going to have cranial nerves. And these are associated with the brainstem, not the brain. And then we have spinal nerves, which are associated, obviously, with the spinal cord. So that's by location, all right? And then we have functional components. Our major functions are sensory or motor. Now, as a multicellular organism, we need to be able to respond to changes in our environment. So internal changes in blood pressure, glucose levels, and hydration, sodium levels. Changes in our external environment. So whether we're cold or pain, that we step on something sharp or burn our hand. Okay? And as a multicellular organism, we can't just touch this and have the cells process what we're touching. So we have a central processor, the brain, to a limited extent the spinal cord. We have to have some mechanism of getting that sensory stimuli to the central nervous system. And so those are sensory neurons. Then we have to have some mechanism of getting a motor response back to the muscle. And those are motor neurons. All right? So we have neurons that function in between, that are neither sensory or motor, that are considered integrative when I'm solving a math problem. I'm not doing a sensory or a motor function. All right? So there's other neurons in addition to the sensory and motor, but that's what we list primarily as function. The sensory and motor is found in both the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So let me illustrate. Let's say that I step on something sharp. Cell body of this sensory neuron is found outside the central nervous system, and that's a spinal nerve. Okay? It's found outside the central nervous system, spinal nerve. Or I drink something hot and burn my tongue. So coming from my tongue, from the trigeminal nerve, comes into the brainstem, the ganglia, where those cell bodies are located, or just outside the sella turcica. So this would be a cranial nerve. Right? So even though it's part of the peripheral nervous system, it still has a part inside the central nervous system, because it has to contact those neurons that are part of the central nervous system. All right? Now, the central nervous system has its own sensory neurons. I mean, just sending it to the spinal cord or sending it to the brainstem, our processing of pain is done in the brain. So if I were to cut the spinal cord here and tap you on your knee, you would have a motor response of kicking your knee out. But would you feel me tapping on your knee? No, because that hasn't been processed yet. So within the central nervous system, we have neurons that will continue to carry this electrical information to the brain for processing. So while the peripheral nervous system, our cranial nerve and spinal nerves, have sensory neurons, the central nervous system does as well. All right? So separating by central nervous system is purely a locational organization that overlaps with the functional. Now, in response to the pain, all right, I'm going to move. I'm going to take my foot off of the tack. I'm going to go get a drink of cold water or put ice on my tongue. Or drink some milk, cold milk or something. So in response to that, we have a motor response. And so that originates either in the spinal cord as a reflex or a voluntary movement. Now, technically this would be in a different part of the brain, but for illustration purposes, I'm putting it in the same diagram. So we have a motor neuron that moves down to the brainstem, or a motor neuron that moves down to the spinal cord. And then in the cranial nerve, we would have a motor neuron. Remember the hypoglossal nerve? So that's going to come out and go to the tongue. Pass it to my spinal nerve. It's going to come out and go to the tongue. Or a motor nerve will go to muscles of the leg. So again, the central nervous system contains motor neurons, and the peripheral nervous system contains motor neurons. So that separation by sensory and motor function is seen in both the central and the peripheral nervous system. Okay. Now we can further divide the motor component by whether it goes to voluntary skeletal muscle or whether it's innervating involuntary heart muscle, smooth muscle. So the next slide shows the same information, but a little bit more color. There's a typo error. I think in your slide, on your page, it says sensory. It should say somatic. Over here. Does it say somatic? Okay, a couple people this morning were changing. The online slides, maybe when you print them off, those will still say. Those will still say sensory. All right, so just looking at this slide before I put anything up on the board. So here are the sensory and motor divisions of our system. Now we typically use these terms primarily for the peripheral nervous system because we have afferent and efferent cells in the brain that are merely talking about the direction of the nerve impulse, and it may not be sensory or motor. But in our cranial nerves and in our spinal nerves, we can use those terms for sensory and motor aspects. So afferent means going towards the central nervous system. All right, so any impulses that are being carried towards the spinal cord are going to be sensory. We use that term afferent. Anything that's going to be carried away, going towards a muscle or a gland to activate it, is efferent. Think of E for exit, all right, going away from. Now when we look at sensory, we have sensory from two different areas of the body. Somatic refers to soma or body wall. All right? That means skin and skeletal muscle. And we'll look at this when we talk about specific terms for types of neurons. And then for motor, we have two different types of motor neurons going to the body wall, going to skeletal muscle, okay, or going to smooth muscle or cardiac gland. So in our next nerve unit, we have 3 or 4 days that we spend just on the autonomic nervous system. I've expanded this region of the course because, as I've said before, this is the one area of any of the material that we talk about for the entire semester that you're going to carry with you to the next semester. Because the autonomic control regulates heart and reproductive and digestive and all the other systems that we're talking about in the second semester. So in looking at this aspect, on the next page of your lecture notes, we have classes of peripheral neurons that are described by these terms. It looks kind of complicated, but it makes sense when you actually think of what the word means. So on page 4, we have 3 different classes of sensory neurons and 2 different classes of motor neurons that match up with this page, this slide. We'll use these terms towards the end of this unit when we talk about the types of fibers, the types of neurons that we see in our cranial nerves. All right, for instance, the trigeminal nerve is sensory, okay? And it's sensory from the skin and from the regions of the skin. And so we call it an afferent. It contains afferent neurons. So all sensory neurons that are in the peripheral nerves are going to be considered to be afferent. And so general, sensory, I call it general, somatic, afferent. Somatic means body wall. So this is going to come from the skin and from skeletal muscle. And joints. Right? That's the area that we talk about covered with somatic. So that's referring over here to somatic stimuli. So a general somatic afferent neuron is going to carry stimuli from impulses such as pain. Right? So that cold or hot fluid on the tongue. Your eye, you tore your contact and it caused an abrasion on your eye, so the trigeminal nerve has general somatic afferent neurons for pain. Discriminative touch. What that means is being able to tell the difference between an apple and a nectarine or a peach just by what it feels like. All right, so not just pressure. That's a difference. And joint sense. Now, you utilize joint sense or proprioception in that skin lab, the extra credit, where you try to close your eyes and try to figure out where someone had touched you with the pen. So you had to know whether your elbows or your fingers were flexed or extended. All right, so knowing where your body is, I did that, knowing where your body is in space, okay, is joint sense. So all of that is carried by general somatic afferent. Visceral refers to organ. So general, visceral, afferent is coming from body organs. So we're talking about the viscera, torso. Now, you never get a tickle in your kidney, okay? And the outside of your heart doesn't itch. So there's a limited amount. We don't have a joint sense. I can't say, well, you know, my intestine is now behind my stomach and over here. We might know where a gas bubble is, but we don't know where what the organs are doing. You swallow cold water, it doesn't feel icy when it hits your stomach wall, all right? So we typically don't see all of these particular senses when we look at organs. We're limited to pain. And we could include in that stretch, because we usually don't feel stretch until it's painful. Okay, so like gas pain. and pressure. So if a man's having a heart attack, that's usually not a feeling that a woman has. But when a man's having a heart attack, you may describe an elephant sitting on his chest. All right? So not a lot of variety in those visceral feelings. And then we have additional organs, such as the eye, or the inner ear, that are special senses. All right? Taste, vision. So the last classification of afferent is special, visceral, afferent. And this would be from special sense organs. I'm redundant. How many special senses do we have? Anybody know? 5. People talk about having a sixth sense that's on top of the special senses. So we have vision, taste, smell, balance, and hearing. Okay. So the neurons that carry information for vision or balance, and by balance we're talking about the inner ear. Proprioception is necessary for balance, and the eye is necessary for balance. But we're talking about the inner ear. When that doesn't work, you have vertigo. Okay. I guess I left a word off here. All right, so 3 different types of stimuli, or afferent neurons, that are carried in our cranial nerves or peripheral nerves and processed in the brain. And then we have 2 different types of motor neurons. Okay? Those that are carrying voluntary motor neurons to the skeletal muscle for deliberate movement, and those that are carrying involuntary or autonomic neurons. All right? You guys have this down? It's in your lecture notes. Do you need more time?